Welcome everyone to the 2022 Haynes Lecture by Dr. Elizabeth Savage, presented by the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill Libraries and its Wilson Special Collections Library. I am Emily Cater, Interim Curator of Rare Books, and I'd like to thank Maria Estorino, Interim Vice Provost for University Libraries and University Librarian, for her support for this lecture series, and invite her to make our opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Emily. I'm really happy to be here with everyone. The Haynes Lecture Series in Bibliography began in 1980 and brings distinguished scholars to UNC to speak on topics in the history of the book. Past Haynes lecturers have included scholars such as Paul Needham, G.T. Tanzel, Michael Winship, Ruth Mortimer, Elizabeth Eisenstein, and many others. We are deeply grateful to the Haynes Foundation, established by the Haynes family of Winston-Salem, which supports both the lecture series and the University Library's millionth volume tradition. Historically, every millionth volume that is added to the library's collection is celebrated with a special gift given by the Haynes family. Today's lecture celebrates the acquisition of our 9 millionth volume, a collection of approximately 900 woodcut printing blocks from the Propaganda Fide press. The press was established by the Catholic Church as part of its mission to spread Christianity throughout the world. Between 1625 and 1850, it printed books in various languages, including guides for priests learning new languages and publications that communicated the tenets of the Church. The block's role as printing technology and in global history makes them valuable to research in many fields and important to the history of the book and bookmaking. I'm deeply grateful to Dr. Savage for helping us to relaunch the Haynes Lecture Series today, and to all of you for joining us in celebrating our 9 millionth acquisition. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Emily.
Thank you, Maria. I would like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Elizabeth Savage, Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, is Senior Lecturer in Book History and Communications in the School of Advanced Study, University of London. Her research into pre-industrial European printing techniques across text and image, especially for color, in the 15th and 16th centuries, has won awards, including the Schulman and Bullard Article Prize. Her latest book is Early Color Printing, German Renaissance Woodcuts at the British Museum. Her forthcoming edited volumes are Printing Color, 1700 to 1830, and Printing Things, which positions blocks, plates, and other objects that printed as objects of research. She regularly curates and contributes to exhibitions linked to historical printing techniques, including at the British Museum and the Musée du Louvre. She teaches at London Rare Book School. We're so pleased to have Dr. Savage with us today. In order to head off any technological or time zone related difficulties, Dr. Savage has recorded her remarks for us, but she is live here with us to answer questions. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Elizabeth Savage, and we're going to share the video. Give us one moment. Give us one moment while we work out some technical difficulties with no sound. Thank you for your patience.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for bearing with us. It looks like I'll need to give the talk live after all, rather than in the pre-recorded version that we hoped would prevent any internet mishaps. If you give me just one more minute so I can adjust the lighting, I'll be able to start. Thank you again for your patience. Hello, thank you again for your patience. First off, are you able to hear me? And are you able to see me?
We are. Thank you,
Okay.
Dr. Savage, for your flexibility.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And then now, can you see the screen that I'm sharing with the title of the slide?
Yes, we can.
Okay, and is that coming through clearly? Is it pixelated or is it?
It looks crisp on my
Visible?
end.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much again for everybody for your patience. We had tried to use a pre-recorded version to avoid this kind of thing, but IT happens. And we'll be talking about technology in any case and the foibles of it. So in a sense, it's not a bad way to start off. I should note, I believe it's already been noted, but just in case, the recording is being, the talk is being recorded. And there will be Q&A that follows. If you have questions, please do ask them in the chat now or save them to the end, but we will be responding to questions in the order received after the talk. With that being said, I'd like to thank Emily Cater, the interim curator of rare books at special collections at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, first for reviving the series, the Haynes Lecture Series in Bibliography, and secondly, for inviting me to give you a Haynes lecture today. I'd also like to thank Elizabeth Ott, the Haynes curator of rare books, for bringing this incredible acquisition to my attention. My lecture is about the 9 millionth volume, the 9 millionth volume that was acquired by the university libraries at North Carolina, but it's not a volume, it's not a book. As you can see in this tweet announcing its acquisition, it's a collection of about 900 woodcut printing blocks. They're all from the Propaganda Fide press in Rome, from about 1625-ish until about 1850-ish. And I'm saying ish carefully because although most haven't been identified, it's already possible to say that this acquisition is hugely important for research across a number of fields. These are interdisciplinary objects. They're art historical, bibliographical, linguistic, and theological. They're works of craftsmanship. They're not finished pieces, but at the same time, they're structurally stable craft objects that are completed in and of themselves. And we don't know what to call them because there's currently no standards for describing or cataloging them across the GLAM sector, that's galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. There are specific descriptive terms, but not ones that are consistent across all of GLAM and not ones that are consistent with those that practitioners use. So I think this acquisition represents something so important for propaganda fide research, but also for the historical humanities, and maybe even computer vision and artificial intelligence, so much more broadly. And I'll explain that part at the end. So this acquisition reinforces a huge research turn towards printing practices, materiality, and craft knowledge. Critical making is another term that's used. So in the last 10 years, I've seen many tens of thousands of historical woodblocks. Almost all of them have been uncatalogued or even unaccessioned, and for decades, because they're square pegs that don't fit into the round holes that are required for many museums or libraries' cataloging protocols. So effectively, this category of cultural heritage object has been ignored. And there are a number of other factors at play. For example, the social hierarchy of print collectors and artists over artisans, which is false and damaging and leads to a misunderstanding of cultural heritage more broadly. But I think things are changing. At the minute, the first ever major cataloging and digitization drives for woodblock collections started in the last couple of years. For example, at Planta Matrices in Antwerp, there's 14,000 16th century woodblocks that have just been fully cataloged and digitized and made available for the first time. And that's incredibly useful because it's difficult to access them in person. They're very toxic due to an overly generous pesticide treatment several decades ago. I might talk about the lack of general standards for conservation for objects like this in a minute. There's over 1,000 16th century German woodblocks that have just been cataloged and digitized at the Kupferstiftkabinet Berlin. I actually gave a talk at a symposium about this new project earlier today. This is timely and this is happening now. The inclusion of 15th and 16th century woodblocks in the new Census of Italian Renaissance woodblocks is incredible, and it marks a turn in union catalogs that link the woodblocks across collections to the materials they were used to print across collections. Another example is that the Society of Antiquaries in London has recently discovered about 3,000 woodblocks that are built into the fabric of the building. The cupboards are below the stairs. And they're about to start the initial stock take in order to catalog them. There's a bit of noise coming from outside. Sorry, give me 1 second to close the window. I don't want that to be a distraction. I can't pause the video, 1 second. Apologies. Like I said, the foibles of technologies and the best laid plans. As I was just talking with the antiquaries. So yes, all of these new projects to acknowledge the materiality, the existence of wood blocks in cultural heritage collections as coinciding with a growing interest in copper plates. They've long been a subject of research in Italy due to Anna Grella's visionary work on the copper plate collection, or the Calcografia, at Italy's National Institute for Graphic Design. I never miss a chance to celebrate my students, and my PhD student, Chiara Betti, currently has an incredible collaborative project at the Bodleian Library to assess hundreds of its 18th century copper plates, including with a scanning electron microscope. So there's a huge amount of growing interest for the first time in material like this, and a huge range of research methodologies that are just starting to develop to understand them. So this acquisition contributes to a growing international research trend to discover this long ignored category of cultural heritage objects. The blocks themselves can be hugely important for research, but unusually, the cataloging protocols and research methodologies that are used to understand them, even as a basis for cataloging, and the terms used to describe them, can also constitute significant contributions to scholarship in and of themselves. So here's what we know about the collection. It was produced around 1625 to 1850-ish for the Roman Catholic Church's former evangelization and missionary arm, Propaganda Fide, or Propagation of the Faith. It includes 919 blocks for wood cuts and wood engravings. Most of them are wrapped in a piece of paper, often printer's waste with an identifying impression. So there's actually about 2,000 items in this acquisition. Half are the blocks, half is the printer's waste and the impressions around them. For the iconography, many depict biblical and devotional images, coats of arms, ornaments, headpieces, diagrams, maps, highly varied kinds of content. Many of them have xylographic text, or text that's cut from a woodblock rather than printed from metal movable type. And this is especially for language groups that didn't have available metal movable type at the moment of the printing of these texts. And that includes East Asian, Middle Eastern, Slavic language groups. It includes esoteric alphabets like the Celestial alphabet, and quite a lot of Arabic. So there's woodblocks for the heading of each book of the first edition of the complete Bible in Arabic, which was completed in 1671. There are also a number of blocks for Chinese language instruction. At the minute, they're currently being housed by conservation in wrappings, and they can be accessed upon request. So at the minute, the collection has been provisionally divided thematically by UNC. There's one box of alphabets, one box of oversize, one box of coat of arms, one box of historiated devotional, one box of mostly strictly decorative, et cetera, et cetera. And I'll be using these classification schemes today in my talk. I want to be sure that we speak the same language, speaking of terminology. Many of these blocks have not been identified, so I will be using working descriptive titles provided by UNC. I'll be talking about them as print matrices or printing surfaces. The art historians here might say that the matrix is the woodblock. It comes from the Latin for womb, something that produces multiples. And in art historical context, the woodblock produces multiple prints. The bibliographers here might object and say the matrix is the mold used to cast a piece of type, because the piece of type is the matrix that produces, the piece of type is the multiple produced by the matrix of the mold. And so there's a small number of field-specific vocabulary in cognate fields that's directly contradictory. I will try to avoid that term and speak of wood cuts or wood engravings or wood blocks. I'll talk about relief in the sense of the depth of the cutting. The design sits at the top. How deeply is that cut? Or relief as a general printing technique, as with wood blocks, where the design remains on top and the white space or void is cut away, as opposed to intaglio, like copper plates, where the design is incised, or planographic, like lithography, where the design is flush with the surface. For those areas that are cut away, the white spaces, I'll call them voids, but there are a number of terms that can be used to refer to them. And also, I will distinguish woodcuts from wood engravings. And this is a quick aside about the importance of acquisitions like this in institutional collections at this moment. You can see here that UNC is using Library of Congress subject headings to describe the books as specimens of wood engraving. And the art historians here might be surprised or even object, because most of them are wood cuts, not wood engravings. Wood cuts are cut with a knife. It's a technique that's been used for printing since printing was introduced as a large-scale craft in the 1400s in the Holy Roman Empire. Wood engraving developed largely from the 1830s using a dense ingrain and engraving tools like burins for very fine details. There are different crafts with different tools, styles, skills, and historical trajectories. But what UNC has said here, you see at the bottom, they're described as wood engraving specimens, all of them, is absolutely perfect. This follows international best practice because this is what the Library of Congress subject heading requires. Art historians might say it misdescribes this category of art historical or woodcut materials. Bibliographers might say, but this is a useful starting point for researchers to identify this kind of object. So this is not criticism. This is absolutely in line with international best practice. And the good reason is that each collection in each field of research follows different conventions for different purposes. And I think this kind of contradictory vocabulary within cognate fields is one example of the difficulty in describing and cataloging and researching these incredibly interdisciplinary objects. And it speaks to the significance of the acquisition of collections like this for research and developing the cataloging protocols and the research methodologies that suit them. So I think that UNC here has a very strong vision in this acquisition, and that this is one reason why it is so exciting at this moment. I'm going to talk briefly about what Propaganda Fide did and why it printed in the way it did. Then I'll give you a short tour of the woodblock archive now at UNC. I'll talk next about possible methodologies for undertaking research in this collection in future. And finally, I'll sum up and hopefully I will leave you with a few talking points. So its operations, what was Propaganda Fide? It was founded in the 1570s. Pope Gregory XIII created an informal group of cardinals for the Propaganda Fide, the propagation of the faith, to be active in Eastern and Orthodox Christian churches. In 1622, Pope Gregory XV founded the Sacred Congregation for the Propagation of Faith. In 1967, the name was changed to the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples. And this year, in 2022, it was dissolved or merged into the Pontifical Council for Promoting the New Evangelization. So this is a photo of its headquarters at the Palazzo of Propaganda Fide in Rome. And this signals its importance. It was designed by Bernini and then Borromini. It opened in 1626, but was completed about 40 years later in 1667. So this is a very, very old and very prominent organization. And that's because it was created by the Roman Catholic Church to be its arm in countries with a very small or a suppressed Roman Catholic presence. So it's aimed to undertake and facilitate missionary work, to oversee Roman Catholic affairs. So the Cardinal Prefect of Propaganda Fide was sometimes called the Red Pope, the Cardinal's Red, as a remark on the power that he had. It also had the aim of promoting union with Eastern and Orthodox churches, especially Greek, Syrian, Egyptian, Abyssinian, and Slavic. And it was active in Protestant areas like Switzerland and Ireland until the 1800s. And until 1908, it was very active in the United States of America. So its structure and its accountability made it possible for Rome to monitor and regulate missionary work. It operated in every inhabited continent. And in 2016, its jurisdiction included 186 archdioceses, nearly 200. So in other words, it was huge and it was global for centuries. And that ambition was there from its foundation in the early 1600s. And that's why printing was key. It had to produce texts and images at scale for its missions in languages with alphabetic and syllabic systems for which metal movable type was not yet available. So it founded its own printing press 4 years after it itself was created in 1626. And it was at first called the Polyglot Press. It printed Roman Catholic literature in local languages within its enormous jurisdiction. All of the machines and tools in the kit were lost in the Napoleonic Wars. Rome was invaded in 1809. And that makes these 900 woodblocks and nearly 1,000 impressions of them hugely significant, all the more significant. So how did they survive and why? In 1926, another key moment in its history, it was merged with the Vatican's printing press. So this image of the operation of the polyglot press, try saying that 3 times fast, suggests the vast scale of production. And it's almost like a comic book today. It's a narrative image, and it's not a snapshot. It's not an accurate reproduction of the building, but it takes you through each of the steps of the production of texts and books and missionary material within the printing process. So it was organized. So it was an enormous vertical and horizontal consolidation, if that makes sense. And so the image doesn't just show that Propaganda Fide could take control of every aspect in the production, completion, binding, and distribution of the text that it used, but also the vast scale. So if you look at the central images, you see that the halls recede far into the distance. So this is a comment on the scale and the ambition and the self-contained structure of the polyglot press. So this sample page shows, sorry, I've just been told there's an issue with the screen. Could you please let me know, do you see an image on the screen or is it black to everyone?
I see it on my end.
Okay, wonderful. I'll continue then. So this is the press, the narrative image of the immensity of the press operations. And this is the kind of stuff it produced. This is a sample page from the 1630s that shows how woodcuts were used for text. So this is xylographic, as well as typographic. So the letters in Roman are for movable type. The other letters are woodcut. And this is necessary because there is no metal movable type that's available for these characters. So we often think of woodblocks as art historical materials, carriers of images, but they're also bibliographical materials. They carry text. And UNC's woodblocks depict texts as well as images. This is one example of how. A grand total of 3 woodcuts are held in the Propaganda Fide archive at the Vatican. This is one of them. It's a xylographic woodcut for printing a Bible in Arabic. You see the wormholes, the way the voids were cleared, and the traces of printing ink from the surface. But more importantly, you see how the characters of the language are cut with an incredible amount of skill and detail that, if you're not familiar with the history of xylographic printing, you might assume was reserved only for images. The blocks were used in a standard way. This is a 45-second video from the Victorian Albert Museum's excellent series on traditional craft processes. I highly recommend it, and it was filmed in Cambridge's historical printing room, which I also highly recommend. This is of a book, but imagine one big woodcut taking up the spaces of the tiny pieces of type. Everything is locked in the form very tightly, so you should be able to lift up that form and no piece of type would fall out. And you should be able to apply that sticky ink with those inking balls. It's very thick, almost like tar, without any pieces coming up. There's a puller and a beater. One person with clean hand pulls the lever and exchanges the paper. The person with inky, messy hands applies the ink. Now, this printing press itself is from the 1970s. It follows a historical model. Pip Gaskell had it commissioned. But it's exactly the kind of press that would have been used by Propaganda Fide, because the press is such a conservative technology. It didn't change substantially from Gutenberg's adaptation of existing press structures in the 1450s until the Industrial Revolution after the 1830s. So keep these processes in mind. So of these 900 that you even see, I want to talk through 6 representative examples. And I'll talk about the research challenges that they pose to catalogers. How do we identify the subject, iconography, and date? How do we know the designer, the publication, and the function? And what else can we ask of these objects, even if we don't yet know by whom or what or when or why each one was printed? So first, a representative block from Symbols Box 4. Items like this are being digitized in this way, in their wrapper. So this is representative of how the 900 blocks will be able to be accessed online. Here, it looks like the content differs from the printed, from the print that wraps around it. But of course, the relief that's cut into the block would be in reverse of the printed information. And also this wrapper, I'm told, is slightly offset from the relief of the block. So I don't know what the block looks like. I don't know what the language is, although I recognize small chemical symbols, and some generous minds on Twitter confirmed some other unusual symbols. But given the nature of propaganda fide publications, I imagine this might be a rich topic for another researcher to identify. So I'm showing this to you as a representation of how you'll be able to access these blocks once the documentary photography is completed. Emily Cater kindly unwrapped 5 other blocks so that I could see how they were cut and their physical characteristics. And of those, one is Man Arms Outstretched from Historiated Devotional Box 1 of 1. And here you have the impression that's printed on the paper wrapper. The letter A looks typeset, so you might fairly want to describe this as woodcut and letterpress, but you'd be wrong. That A is xylographic, it's cut from the woodblock. And as we'll see, determining what text is typeset and what's woodcut or wood engraved can be effectively impossible unless you have reference to that original printing surface. The voids are negative space, are fairly roughly cut in some areas, especially around the bottom edges. And the relief of the cutting is fairly high. I think you'll see in a second, but this very thin line would be sculpturally quite fragile. So you can see it's not a strip, but it's tapered, more of a mound, to add strength and prevent the thin line from breaking. The reverse, as a modern inventory labeled J, we don't know what that means. And the block itself isn't square. You can see that one side is really roughly angled. It's roughly hacked. So I thought, well, is that damage from before or after printing? Because the wood itself doesn't seem to be discolored. The damaged wood is no lighter than the wood that surrounds it. There's a bit of mystery, but it gets better. Let's look at the block diagram with circles, oversized. It's a diagram with Hebrew and Latin, and there are 2 characters on the reverse, presumably previous inventory identifiers. The reverse here is also very clean, so it has not been handled by many inky fingers. There is an unusual abbreviation, tetrag for tetragrammatron. So I went to Google with the original spelling, Gloria tetrag, Jehovah with an I, and Dominus with a V. And there was 1 hit in Google Books. And here I've reversed the photo of the woodcut for ease of comparison, but the woodcut is, of course, in reverse. There was 1 match, and I'm certain that the impression is from this block or a copy of it, because that crack in the circle around Gloria is reproduced in the impression. But the woodcut had damage later. So in the wood block, the wormhole above the crack is later damaged after this impression was printed. So if we find any impressions that show a gap there, they must have been printed later. That can help establish the chronology of the use of this block. So the diagram can now be identified as from the book, the Bibliotheca Magna Rabbinica, published by Propaganda Fide, 1693, volume 4, page 535. It might have been printed earlier, it might have been printed later. I'm not sure, but at least we have a starting point for this kind of research. 3 more details caught my eye. First, like the very earliest European woodcut blocks that survive from the early to mid 1400s, it's cut in incredibly high relief. There's nearly 1 centimeter of wood cut away between the top of the design and the void, or that negative area at the bottom of the design. And that must be why these narrow lines are so incredibly tapered here. Such broad mounds, they would break otherwise. Second, like those very early woodblocks, it has incredibly smooth voids. I thought, why invest the time and effort into smoothing them if they wouldn't be visible? Was there an issue with the paper being too damp, so it sunk down? Was there an issue with the press? I don't know, and I'd love to learn more. The third thing I noticed is that the surface is slightly abraded. You can see the natural color of the wood. Now that means that the printing ink has not been impregnated into the block. Now, normally that happens not only with inking, but especially with cleaning. After you apply the oil-based printing ink and you're done with the project, you apply it as many times as you have an impression. But when you're done and you need to put the block away, you clean it with the solvent that dilutes the ink. And that more liquid ink then runs down into the voids and impregnates the wood so much more easily. And once it's there, you can't get rid of it unless you sand the block. And this clearly has not been sanded. So I thought it's really strange to see that the ink impregnation is so shallow on this block. Here's a side view, including that abrasion. And that raises more questions. Look at that incredibly high relief. And look how the block curves up at the corner, just like the wood block we saw a few minutes ago. My understanding is that this is original, not later damage. And that means it would not have been possible to lock this block or our earlier block into the form. Remember, you have to be able to lift that up and move it without any tiny pieces of type coming out. You can also see how incredibly shallow that ink impregnation is. It doesn't sink into the wood. And so I wonder how many times this was printed. Maybe it was printed just 1 or 2 times. There's no ink on the sides either. So perhaps it was abandoned after proofing and never used, but then why would it have been kept at this archive? And why would our first one have been kept as well? So I thought, well, maybe they were intended to be copied from, not printed from directly. And the ink residue is from proofing and the identifying impression on the wrapper. Now let me explain. Propaganda Fide had to produce vast numbers of books, which were distributed for free. Printing each copy of the book from an individual woodblock would take a long time. So maybe Propaganda Fide didn't. In the earlier years of that press, the blocks could have been duplicated by dabbing or pressing them into molten type metal to create an exact mold. As far as I'm aware, there's one tool or machine for dabbing that survives. Otherwise, it could be done manually. Once the type metal cooled, that mold could be filled with a fresh load of molten type metal to create exact copies of the wood block. In the later years of the press, from the early 1700s, the blocks could have been copied with a wet paper flong, which is flunged. It's much like the dry flong or dry matrix mat that you see here from the 1950s. Layers of thin paper are beaten onto the wood block, then uses molds for casting exact copies or stereotypes. That's where our word stereotype comes from, that exact copy. Now, in both cases, the dab or stereotype plate would be nailed to a block of wood to bring it to type high, like the example on the right from the 1850s. Both of these images are later and not from Propaganda Fide, but they're the clearest examples I could find to explain the processes. So if you have multiple copies like this block, multiple originals, it doesn't matter if the original wood block would lock into the form or not, because you wouldn't print from it. And this way you could have simultaneous production, which could cut down the time enormously. And the plates could then be melted down for reuse afterwards. So if I'm right, this could offer fascinating insights into workshop practice during these centuries. Now, our wood block was used in 1693. It's large. Based on my own informal and not very successful experiments, it's difficult to dab evenly. Many copies would have been taken from it. If consistency was used, possibly other diagrams in the book. Now, if that's correct, that might rewrite the history of dabbing and stereotyping and copying, printing things or printing surfaces or print matrices, and thereby workshop practice and print technologies. Or it might mean that these wood blocks were printed from for only one print run each. And so they would not have been cleaned multiple times. I would find that surprising given the quantity of books that Propaganda Fide issued for free distribution. But I'll be glad to know your thoughts on the questions. Another example, large horizontal block with spaces for inserted blocks, oversized. So here you see the printed impression, and to be true to scale, this is huge. I don't know what kind of common press it could have fit in. It is absolutely enormous. And it contains ornamental imagery with 3 passepartouts or frames in which you can insert additional wood blocks or movable type. The cutting is very, very fine and in a very low relief. But what's strange to me here is the ink that's in the very large areas of voids that's surrounded by the natural color of the wood. So you have these islands of printing ink in the large voids. Now, the ink ball touches the upper surface, not the void, unless the voids are very large and the ink ball is very squishy. It was stuffed with wool. But that wouldn't explain why only some of the larger voids have those islands of ink surrounded by plain wood. I thought, well, maybe this goes back to the issue of cleaning, because after printing, you dip your rag in solvent or sprinkle the solvent on the block and you wipe it, dilutes the printing ink, which runs down into the voids and impregnates the wood. And that increases each time the block is inked and cleaned. So again, I suspect that this block was printed once or twice for proofing and the identifying impression on the wrapper. And so you know what I think that might mean, one of 2 options. So I really do wonder if Propaganda Fide was routinely multiplying its wood blocks far earlier than we know other presses were doing this, or if it was genuinely printing these one and done, and for some reason retaining the blocks over the centuries, although they would not be used again. In the side view, you see the structure is very strange. This comprises 2 planks of wood, and I've never seen this before. There's one with a cutting at the top, and then below is a second piece of wood that raises that to type height. I wonder if it's because the block is so long and thin, maybe cheaper wood was used to bulk it up. I'd love to know your thoughts afterwards. But in any case, you can see how shallow that ink impregnation is here. And if we move to Swan's strictly decorative box 1 of 2, here you can see the number 60 on the wrapper. And you see the wood block here. And if we pay attention to what we can't see in the printed image, the information we get from the block that we don't get from the print, like the voids, you can see that, again, it's very, very roughly cut and not very even around the edges. The cracks and damages here, again, is clearly represented in the image. Remember, the block is in reverse of the printed impression. That W shape in the middle might look like damage to very fine hatching lines, but you can see from the wood block that it's deliberate highlighting. The reverse is covered in what seem to be sideways impressions of sorts or pieces of movable type. Again, I've not seen this in other collections, and I have seen tens of thousands of wood blocks from this time period. I don't know what to make of this. And if you have any ideas, I'd be very glad to know. I'll show you a detail in our next one. Here you see the very shallow relief of the cutting, more in line with what we'd expect, but much more shallow. But you also see 3 wooden dowels that are inserted to repair the block after it's split. That suggests that the block was used again and again or over time. Normally the block wouldn't split so early on. The splitting has to do with the way the way drying puts pressure on the wood grain. So you would not expect this minimal ink impregnation together with this kind of evidence of long-term use or long-term repair. I thought that could be justified if there's value in the block itself. For example, if it's linked to an exceptional moment or an exceptional producer, or if it was a workhorse, a block that was used again and again and again. Neither makes sense. So with the caveat that we don't know when this block was repaired, I'd love to know your thoughts about why it would have been preserved in this way. Our last example is wood engraving from strictly decorative box 1 of 2. The wood engraving has 80 written in the top corner, and you can see the printer's waste to the side. The lines here are incredibly fine. I suppose it could be a woodcut with a knife, at least in parts, but this is the kind of incredibly fine relief and detailed work you'd expect of wood engraving with engraving tools like Buren. And this is what you want woodblocks to look like. This is a kind of thick, glossy, dark ink impregnation you expect to see on heritage woodblocks. And you see this often on all sides because inky hands spread ink. And once you've applied the solvent and you're handling the block, the ink goes everywhere. But the reverse looks like this. It has the usual unusual characteristics. Very, very little residue of printing ink. Deeply angled edges and irregular edges that would prevent the block from being locked securely in the form. And now we have very deeply impressed pieces of type. So here you can see the profile of sorts or pieces of type. It's very, very clear. In these pictures, you can see these nicks. It's called a shoulder, which is at the bottom of the piece of type. And it allows the compositor to feel that they're all placed in the correct orientation. You set type upside down and backwards. So if you mind your P's and Q's, you pay attention to where that nick is. So, well, this is extraordinary. The wood must be soft, or the pressure or impact must have been hard. I don't know if there's any way to link this kind of artifact of workshop materials to Claiborne's. Sorry. Sorry. Excuse me. What was I saying? The deep impression of these sorts. There's been incredible research published recently in the Journal of the Printing Historical Society on fallen type, in which you see the same kind of thing in ink. If a piece of type fell during an impression, was pulled up by the ink ball and pressed down. But for the impression of pieces of type in wood blocks, I would love to know what you think. Maybe the impact was soft, or the pressure was, or the wood was soft, or the pressure or impact was hard. I don't know. Interestingly, you can also see knife trials or Buren trials. These kinds of cutting trials are like pin trials for manuscripts. The cutter or engraver was testing the sharpness of their tools. So at UNC, each millionth acquisition is a landmark that's funded by the John Wesley and Anna Hodgkin Haynes Foundation and the Whitaker Library Foundation. And these landmarks are specifically selected to demonstrate a commitment to supporting emerging scholarship, supporting scholarship as it evolves. And in this case, to advancing what scholarship into book and print history can be, what artifacts we can use as objects of research. So it's up to us as researchers, as catalogers, as practitioners to discover what these blocks are and what they mean for scholarship. So en masse, how would we check nearly 1,000 unidentified wood blocks of text and images and symbols against a mind-bogglingly enormous impression of printed pages issued across the centuries? First, I mentioned a simple Google search can help if there are unusual spellings or combination of words. Here it was blind chance that Tetragrammaton was abbreviated in an unusual way, followed by Jehovah, spelled with an I, preceded by Gloria, unusual combination of words and spellings. I think in future, the waste paper of wrappers might be helpful. And maybe they have text from the publication for which the block was intended, or they could indicate a tentative terminus postquem, a date after which a block could have been cut and used. Now, in my experience, this is not reliable. Google Images is not helpful for identifying historical printed imagery, even if it is indexed in Google Books. And that's a huge shame. But it's the only idea that's useful today. The next ideas I'll present might be useful in future, in the next 5 to 10 years, based on pilot projects that focus on related material that are from other places and times. So image matching. My colleague, Giles Burgle, is a book historian, and I'm sorry. Giles is a book historian and digital humanist and very generous scholar. And he's pioneering the use of computer vision to identify printed images with a visual geometry group at Oxford. That's VISE. They created a program called VISE, V for Visual Geometry Group, ISE for Image Search Engine. It's free, open source. You can download it right now in another tab. So at the minute, we don't always have the words to describe these text and images. And with these blocks, it can be very difficult to identify the language based on the characters or syllabaries that are used, especially for languages that are, say, celestial. So an instance level search or a comparison of the entire printed design would be much more useful than, say, a category search, where you identify individual aspects of the iconography. In this case, the identifying image on the wrapper could be a sample image to find all instances of an impression in a digital repository. So that's kind of what you would see here. The result matches the design, not constituent parts. So it's not man and horse, it's matching the entire printed information. But this is what's groundbreaking about Giles's work. He doesn't just find ways to do this. This image is a proof of concept of an image match he demonstrated of a woodblock from the early 1600s to an impression. The image of the woodblock is reversed for ease of comparison here. Now, this is not as simple as reversing an image. As you've seen, the woodblocks can be worked across the entire surface, but with those mounds and the tapering lines, not everything you see will print. So determining what prints and what doesn't is not a simple task, especially when you have the complexity of photographing a very dark, highly reflective surface of ink impregnated woodblocks. So his approach can avoid the ethical issues of printing from unwrapped blocks or from historical woodblocks to achieve an impression. And it can streamline digitization by requiring images of either the wrapper or the block, not both. I think the Propaganda Fide collection would be an excellent candidate for matching because the corpus that needs to be indexed is so well defined, printed by Propaganda Fide in Rome until about 1850. But this comes with caveats. It can take time to prepare the digital images of wrappers to avoid artifacts of the wrappings, wrinkles in the paper. You need a digital repository to search against. And at the minute, image searching isn't possible on archive.org or Google Books. So this is something to consider in future, but please do contact Giles if you'd like to learn more. Another issue is that many of the images are ornaments. They're particularly difficult because they traveled so widely and they were so widely copied. And so many copies and near copies can be attested in so many places of a single printer's ornament. Also, the imagery tends to be abstract, so very difficult to identify iconographically. VISE was used for the image matching and the proof of concept for Ornamento, a project to research printed ornament. Now, there's two arms. A pilot website allows for comparison to 250,000 ornate letters, ornaments, borders, musical notation, diagrams, but only from Iberian prints pre-1700, and it's no longer updated. The real project now has nearly 6 million items from European books, but only pre-1600. And it's not online, not least due to image rights issues due to copyright overreach by institutions that insist that they own copyright over direct reproductions of out-of-copyright material. It does allow searching by bibliographical information like printer, but not iconography, artist, designer, or image match. As Propaganda Fide Press was founded in 1626, it's 26 years too early to be useful here, but maybe a future iteration could be helpful. And a third potential avenue for research in future is a tool like Hazel Wilkinson's database, which has over 1 million printers ornaments from the 18th century. So this is the right time period, but it's based on ECHO, 18th century collections online, so English printed materials. So it's unlikely that Propaganda Fide books would be represented in it. They were printed in Rome, but ornaments traveled and were copied widely, so I thought it's worth a try. So Hazel very generously offered to run some image matching for me. We didn't have any matches. What you see on screen is a demonstration of what the image match could look like. So perhaps future iterations of this kind of research tool will aid in identifying ornament blocks like those in Propaganda Fide. But the first task is to catalog the collection and photograph the objects, and neither of those tasks are as simple and straightforward as you might think. Sorry. Photos are currently being taken of the objects as they are today without unwrapping the wood blocks. And once it is time to unwrap them to digitize or document or research the blocks themselves, very careful choices have to be made. Excuse me. This is because the reflectivity of printing things, whether they're metal plates or wood blocks that are impregnated with black glossy printing ink, mean that choices about photography can optically transform the objects. It can hide or reveal information. There are some excellent examples of this that will be published in a book that I'm editing, Printing Things. But I want to give an example of an intaglio. They're the best examples I have in my own image collection. So these are images of the same etched iron plate. On the left is a snapshot I took with my phone in ambient light. It's not square. On the right is the official photo from Göttingen's photography studio with a single source of light and the camera absolutely square over the image. I think that the ambient light and the angle a bit off square can yield far more useful information for research than that single source ring lighting or perfect lens positioning. I think the formal photography captures equally important information, but a very different kind of information than the kind of information I need. And you have the same risk with wood blocks, and you have an additional risk because they can be so reflective that photos taken from a single direction of light, so in a studio setting, not with ambient light in, say, an office or a reading room, with a lens that is properly positioned, can optically reverse the ups and downs of the relief. So it can look like the voids are at the top and the design is at the bottom. So for my purposes in this talk, I've chosen to use informal photography today. And unless otherwise stated, the photos are all informal snapshots by Emily Cater that she took with the phone in her office in ambient light. So they're perfect for my research needs. And I thank Emily for that. If you'd like to know more, some examples of this optical reversals and photos of 16th century wood blocks will be included in the volume Printing Things, which I'm editing with Femke Spielberg for the British Academy and Oxford University Press. We have about 30 contributors from a huge number of fields, including developers of cataloging languages and computer vision specialists, librarians, curators, researchers, practitioners. And we're trying to make a case for blocks and plates to be considered as objects of research in and of themselves, separate from the content that they print. So we're at the end. Where do we go from here? I think we go back to where we started. And now you know what we know and what we don't know, but how we can find out more. I think these 919 wood blocks and about 900 wrappers of prints and printers' waste are waiting to be explored by book historians, art historians, print historians, but also by linguists and historians of theology and experts in iconography and maps. And because so many were for language training, historians of education and translation. So I'd be very glad to get started or to support others to start identifying these blocks and understanding what they can teach us. In addition to searching by text that maybe could be OCR'd in digitized editions, this might involve image matching against a digitized body of Propaganda Fide publications if one becomes available. But right now, the only corpus, if you call it that, would be the books that happen to be scattered across archive.org, Google Books, online repositories. And automated research at the scale needed to identify 1,000 unidentified blocks within a period of weeks to a month, rather than multiple lifetimes, would probably require some high-level conversations in the first instance. So that's for another day, possibly another year. But for now, I thank Emily Cater again for the kind invitation to speak, and I look forward to your thoughts. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Savage, for that amazing talk and for being flexible. And anyway, it's always great to see somebody who can just go with the flow. So thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over. I know we're at time, but I think if anybody wants to hang around for about 10 to 15 more minutes, maybe for some Q&A, does that sound all right with you, Dr. Savage?
I'm happy to be available for that time. And I apologize again for the technical issues. Everything worked perfectly yesterday.
Same for us.
What can we do?
Okay. Well, so I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Kelly Bullard, who's going to be mediating the Q&A. And also we have the woodblocks here and a document camera. So if we want to look at anything a little bit closer, we can. Kelly is a Master's of Library Science student here at UNC. And in addition to being a graduate assistant with a rare book collection, Kelly is an inaugural Primary Sources Teaching Fellow and the project manager for the Haynes Lecture Series. And we're very grateful to have her. So Kelly, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hi, thanks, Emily, and thank you, Elizabeth. This was a fabulous lecture, and also for being gracious enough to go with the flow. I'm going to begin reading some of the questions that have been submitted to the Q&A box, but I can encourage folks to continue submitting questions to the Q&A box. It's located in the bottom of your toolbar, or sorry, on the bottom center right of your screen in your toolbar. So we're going to start out with a question from Stephen Tabor. I think he's referring to the woodblock that has the type impressions on the bottom of them. He suggests that perhaps the type being there was used for fine spacing in the form or make ready on the fly.
Oh, that's interesting. So make ready, you would pad the bottom of the block with bits of paper or card to ensure that there's even pressure applied to the top. That is fascinating. I don't know how you would apply type. You wouldn't, I mean, there's no residue of glue. I suppose the pieces of type could just be set under the block and then the block printed. I've never come across that. And it wouldn't occur to me because movable type is so thick. Normally make ready would be something like card or paper. That's really interesting. I don't know. I'd be glad to try that out and hope I don't break any pieces of type in the doing. Stephen, if you'd be glad to continue that conversation over email or in a Zoom chat, I'd be really interested to learn your thoughts.
So our next question is from Jacqueline Reed Walsh, and she asks, she'd love to learn a little bit more about the alphabet blocks and whether children were an intended audience.
Oh, that is also very interesting. So the intended audiences for the propaganda fide materials were enormous. Huge numbers of people in huge numbers of cultures and regions of the world, of a huge range of religious beliefs and a huge range of ages. I'm not aware of propaganda fide books that were targeted specifically at children. There might have been some as children's literature developed as a separate specialization, as a genre in and of itself. But it very well could have been. In many cases, the kinds of ornamentation we associate with children's literature today, the pictures, the alphabets, ornaments, were very much part of the reading experience for adults. And so I'm not aware of any alphabet blocks that have imagery that would indicate they were specifically for children. But that doesn't mean that they wouldn't have been used in context of evangelizing or language training linked to children or in which children participated.
Thank you. B. Williams Ellertson asks about the multilingual outreach and is curious about the decision to limit the publications in Latin and the move away from the use of local vernacular languages.
So a decision was made for the main body of the text to be in Latin. It was the lingua franca, the French language of the time, the common language, and also the language of the church in Rome. I see the question now. I don't know what SIL is, so give me a second to click on the link and see what we. Right. Yes. I don't know if in comparison, if the propaganda fide operations intended for populations to move away from their vernacular languages. But they didn't, there was necrotism, they did introduce Latin for specific purposes linked to evangelization. And more importantly, they brought language training to the missionaries. And so rather than moving away from local vernacular languages, in a sense, they were bringing the local vernacular languages to the missionaries and also creating opportunities for synecretization and missionary work within those local languages. So reaching out in those languages and then creating a bridge for speakers of those languages to adopt Latin if they did convert. I don't know if that answers your question, but I'd be very glad to learn more if you have any further questions or additional thoughts. Okay, I see we have another question. Yes, Matilda Malvina is working on woodblocks. Yes, she completed a fantastic PhD at Oxford with Christina Dondi in the 15th century woodblock project. And the image matching she used was Vice, supplied by Giles Burgle with the visual geometry group at Oxford. And there she was looking at illustrations of Aesop. So she had clearly defined images and a corpus of digitized text that they could be matched against. No, thank you for promoting her research. It's wonderful.
We have a question from Matthew Demarcus. Could the block with the darkness in the large relief areas and lightness around the edges be due to the cleaning liquid drying in the middle before drying around the edges? If this is what you're saying already, apologies.
Well, I'm not going to rule anything out. I don't pretend I know the answer here. In my experience, which may not be your experience, the liquid that you clean the block with doesn't behave like that. So it would pool down. The solvent does dry quickly, of course, but it does pool down. And so I imagine that if the liquid is pooling into one of the voids, the liquid would remain unevaporated in the middle for longer. But maybe it's worth doing some research into historical printing ink recipes and solvent recipes or information about solvents that were used for cleaning blocks at this time. And if anybody is aware of information about solvents that were used at this time, I would be delighted to know and see what happens when I give it a go at a print shop. So I see we have a question about coordinating with archives. That can be incredibly useful in certain cases, but not in all cases. And that's because so much of the imagery is abstract ornament. Another issue is that so many of the woodblocks don't have images, but texts in different languages, a huge range of languages, including languages that are not human languages, like alchemical or celestial alphabets. But if it does become possible to coordinate with archives, which is a service that identifies iconography, that could be very useful. I think it could be important to be very careful to tread the right line in terms of iconographic description with devotional content. For example, somebody might say a picture of a naked man and a naked woman in a forest is Adam and Eve, or the narrative of the fall of man. So there are different levels of iconographic description that that can be mapped onto devotional imagery. But archives is adept at this. And so if that is something that is possible for certain aspects of this archive in future, that would be wonderful. See, Stephen Tabor says, Moxon, Moxon wrote the first published account of printing in the 1680s. And so much of what he said reflects, as far as we know, much earlier practice. Lye was used to clean type. Thank you, I didn't realize that. It might be no more volatile than water. Did they have organic solvents then? I would love to do a bit more research and find out. I've never tried cleaning type or wood blocks with lye. But I will, and I'll let you know what happens. Thank you for that. think Hannah said, can you say more about the process of using a dab to make copies of wood blocks? Is this a 17th century practice? Are there presses, publishers that use this more than others? There's very little that's been written about dabs so far. James Mosley's blog and Giles Burgell's blog have some accounts of dabbing. James Mosley's blog is one of the best starting points. And Glenn Fleischman, who's one of the world's most active collectors of flongs and zincos and stereos, also is hugely knowledgeable about dabs and has information on his websites and blog posts about that. There will be information about dabs and the world's, what we think is the world's only device for dabbing, dabbing machine or dabbing tool that survives intact and is usable in the book Printing Things, which Femke Spielberg and I are editing and which will come out next year. But it's very messy and I was not very good at it when I tried. I see Matthew has said, are all the blocks flat without higher areas like Buick did? So for the relief, so Buick was a wood engraver in the early to mid 1800s, and his wood, the surface of his wood blocks. So you have the design that's printed at the top, and you cut away the voids, the relief below. But he actually lowered the surface and modified the height of the surface fractions of a millimeter in order to create slightly tonal effects. Graham Williams has just published 2 wonderful books about this, including prints from Buick's own wood blocks. And the information the results he has found by printing historical blocks on a historical printing press, which applies pressure very differently than a modern press, gives a range of tonal results, even when printing from solid black, that you just can't get from modern woodcuts with a completely flat surface on a modern press. So Matthew, I hope that answers the question. I know it's time to go. Do I have time to make 2 short announcements before we go? Great, thank you. So thank you very much again. 2 quick things before we go about the scope and vision of UNC's acquisition, which is part of a very exciting growing international research trend. First, I've just virtually spoken this afternoon at an event in Berlin that marks the Kupferschiffkabinett, or print collections cataloging and digitization of about 1,500 Old Master German wood blocks. They were collected by Hans Albrecht von der Schau in the early 1800s. About 300 digitized wood blocks are now available on its website. And if I can get the chat up, I'll put a link in. I hope that one of the hosts will be able to send that out if you'd like to see what is happening right now, cutting edge of research and cataloging practices in this area. And I'd also like to mention that the Society of Antiquaries of London, I mentioned it's just found about 3,000 wood blocks under the stairs. It's in the first stages of stock taking in order to catalog them and make them accessible. And they're offering the opportunity to adopt a block for about a tenner. So I've just shared the link with the host, and I hope they can then share that with attendees if you're interested in learning more about this project. And I'm mentioning these because they're happening today. They're happening this week. UNC's acquisition is absolutely at the cutting edge of research and scholarship, both in bibliography and print history, and fields far beyond. So it's been a real pleasure to celebrate this with all of you. And thank you again for the questions.
And thank you so much, Dr. Savage, for sharing your time with us today, and to all of the attendees who have spent this afternoon or whatever time it is where you are with us. Thank you very much. And yes, thank you for joining us today. And that is it.